Hi, welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's video, we're going to go over Chapter 9 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is the last chapter in the book, so let's see how this story turns out, shall we? Alright, here we go for the final conclusion. Alright, let's start the 9th and final chapter of The Great Gatsby. So, this chapter starts off with Nick telling the reader the aftermath of Gatsby's death. He talks about how as soon as the accident happens, the entire house is taped off. There are police everywhere and there's huge crowds drawing around, trying to grab a glimpse of Gatsby's body. Nick mentions the court case that followed and how through all speculations, rumors, and misconstructions, the case was put to rest. Myrtle's sister was on the stand and she kept her composure very nicely, and through all the hearings. The case boiled down to Mr. Wilson becoming a madman. Myrtle's sister states that Myrtle had never had an affair, was always an outstanding person, and was not living a double life. Nick knew this not to be true, but was very surprised, and he admired Myrtle's sister for her intentions. Nick knew that she was doing this to keep the case simple and to keep rumors from flying around. Myrtle's sister also says that her sister never knew of Jay Gatsby. Nick then goes on to tell the reader that after Gatsby was shot, he tried to make communications with everyone he could think of to get a response, and figure out what to do next. Nick states that he feels personally responsible for Gatsby, and to make sure he has a proper funeral. When he reaches out to Daisy, he is informed by their butler that they have gone away for an indiscernible amount of time. When he pushes upon this further, there is no answer that's given. He then tries to contact Mr. Wolfsheim, that he had met earlier that summer, to which Nick was responded with a letter that was not very helpful. Mr. Wolfsheim claims that he was not able to do anything but let him know when the funeral was so that way he may attend. As Nick was making phone calls, he received a phone call from someone in the Midwest, talking about routing numbers and funds and things like that. But then Nick stops him and lets him know that Mr. Gatsby is dead, to which there's a commotion on the other end of the line, and the line goes dead. It was on the third day that Gatsby's father, Henry C. Gatz, contacted him via telephone, telling him to postpone the funeral until he could make it. It was later that day that he arrived at the house, and Nick takes him inside to see his son. Mr. Gatz is overwhelmed with everything that Gatsby was able to accomplish in his life, the wealth that he amassed, and everything else. Nick can sense Mr. Gatz's sadness and brings him something to eat in hopes of cheering him up, but it doesn't. So then Nick takes Mr. Gatz upstairs to where he quickly falls asleep. Later that day, Mr. Klipspringer calls the line of Gatsby's house, to which Nick is very pleasantly surprised. Nick asks if he'll be able to make it to the funeral. Mr. Klipspringer says no, but that he's expected in Greenwich Village for some sort of meeting. Nick gets very impatient with him when he learns the real reason Klipspringer phoned was to ask for his tennis shoes sent back to him. When Mr. Klipspringer says this, Nick just hangs the phone up. Nick mentions that the morning of the funeral he goes into town to see Mr. Wolfsheim. He makes his way to the office and knocks on the door, to which the receptionist says that no one's in. However, Nick can hear Mr. Wolfsheim whistling behind the partition. So, Nick insists, to which the receptionist again tells him no one's there, and that he is in Chicago. Nick mentions Gatsby's name, and very quickly after that, Mr. Wolfsheim comes from behind the partition. Nick asks him to come to the funeral, since he was one of Gatsby's real friends. Mr. Wolfsheim goes into discussion and talks about how he made Gatsby who he was after the war. How when Gatsby came to him, he was nothing but a soldier who had nothing but the clothes on his back and nothing more. He talks about how they went into business together, how he had to continue to rise in the ranks, and when hearing this, Nick then insists that he come to the funeral, to which Mr. Wolfsheim says no, that he doesn't want to get involved or make any scenes in this situation. This results with Nick leaving Mr. Wolfsheim's office and heading back to his house to get ready for the funeral. Once Nick is dressed, he heads back to Gatsby's, where he sees Gatsby's father pacing up and down the stairs. Gatsby's father pulls out a picture from his wallet and shows Nick. It's a picture of the house they were standing in. Through a small conversation, we learn that Gatsby had last seen his parents 2 years prior, where he bought them a house. That his father also showed Nick a copy of an old book that Gatsby had left in their house. Inside of it contained his daily schedule, to which the father beamed with pride. Nick lets the reader know that Gatsby loved his parents and wanted to make a better life for him and for them. Nick then mentions that a little before 3 o'clock, the minister arrives for the funeral. Nick asks him to hold on just a little while longer until more people can arrive. At 5 o'clock, the funeral begins, and Nick notes that only 3 cars were in attendance: the hearse, Nick, and Mr. Gatz, and the man with the eagle-eye glasses. They were the only ones in attendance, along with several servants. Nick mentions that it's pouring rain, and the funeral service begins. After the funeral service, the eagle-eyed man comments how people used to come into this house by the droves, but no one could afford to show up for the funeral. After this moment, Nick mentioned that he never again sees the eagle-eyed man. Nick then reminisces about the Midwest with the reader. He mentions Christmas time specifically, and the memory of him being in college and everyone heading on the trains to head home for break. He also mentions that this is what the Midwest is really about. The family, the friends, the generations of history in each town, how each house is not remembered specifically by shape or by size, but by the family who lives in it and the people who come from it. He says all of this to note that the East will never be like the Midwest. The East is always changing, it's always growing, and the land is not held special by the people. So, he decides that he's going to move back to the Midwest. Before he moves back, he knows he has one last task to accomplish. He schedules a meeting with Jordan and sets everything right. He talks about Gatsby's death, the funeral, and how he should have treated her better. Jordan mentioned that she is now engaged to be married to a new man. She also tells him that she's always admired him for being a straightforward talker. To which Nick says he's 30 and doesn't have the ability to lie to himself or to anyone else. She also mentions the conversation they had months prior about her driving, and how she had met another careless driver on the road. After this conversation, Nick turns away knowing that he will never again see her. Nick mentions that one afternoon in October, he saw Tom Buchanan walking down the street. As Tom caught his eyes, he reached out a hand for Nick to shake. However, Nick refuses to shake his hand, and Tom asks what's the matter. Nick responds with, "You know what I think of you," to which Tom takes offense and says he's crazy as hell. They have a small conversation where Tom confirms what Nick believed about that day. Mr. Wilson had made his way to Tom's house with the gun in his pocket and his hand on the trigger. It was Tom who told Mr. Wilson that Gatsby killed his wife. Tom says that Gatsby got what was coming to him. He threw dust and daisy in Nick's eyes, and then it was all Gatsby's fault. Nick was dumbfounded when Tom told him this, and Nick could see in Tom's eyes that he believed he was doing the right thing. He makes a comment to himself and to the reader about how Tom and Daisy were careless people, how they used everyone and everything, smashed up everything into small pieces, and then retreated back into their wealth and their carelessness, or whatever it may be, to let everybody else clean up the mess. At this moment, he realizes that there is no getting through to Tom, so he shakes his hand and walks away. Nick then tells the reader of the last day before he moves back to the Midwest, how he goes over to Gatsby's house after his trunk was packed and looks at the house one final time. He makes his way down to the beach and lays out in the sand. He looks over at West Egg across the bay and imagines as if it were brand new for the first settlers of the continent. How man must have looked out and for the last instant saw something that was pure. Then Nick thinks of Gatsby and what he must have thought when he first stepped out onto his lawn and could see the green light coming from Tom and Daisy's dock. He notes that Gatsby must have been so close yet so far away. Nick mentions how Gatsby must not have known that as hard as he reached out, everything was already behind him. Nick also mentions that Gatsby believed in the green light, the future that years and years receded before them, and that it eluded them. Tomorrow we may run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. But he stops himself. So he mentions that they beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. This is the final moments of The Great Gatsby. Tune in for a companion video that we talk about the book, what it means, and why it still holds place in today's society. We also will be doing a movie review of The Great Gatsby. We hope to see you there. Have a great one. We hope you enjoyed this series, and as always, stay lit.